Which Super Bowl champ of the last 10 years is the best? Which champion is the greatest? And where do the Philadelphia Eagles fit on the list of the last 10 Super Bowl champions? Welcome, football fans, to my ranking of the last 10 Super Bowl champs. I'm talking 2015 Denver Broncos through the 2024 Philadelphia Eagles. Which team is the best? Which team is the worst? We are going to identify the list by talking about rosters, by talking about talent, dominance, accomplishment. We're talking about balance offensively, defensively, statistics. We are going to drive our argument based on all of the elements that make up a great football team and come to a decision that is, where do the Eagles fit and who is the best team of the last 10 seasons. If that sounds good, Gronk, spike the like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more NFL content just like this. I love doing this historic content for you guys, so if you do enjoy, Gronk, spike that like button. It really helps the video. And get in the comments and let me know, how good do you think the Eagles are from this past season? Do you think they're the best team of the last 10 years? How high would you have them on the list? And which team do you think over the past 10 years was, in fact, the best? Let's waste no more time, guys. Let's begin with the number 10 team on the list. At number 10, the 10th greatest Super Bowl champ of the last 10 years, that would be the 2017 Philadelphia Eagles. This was really difficult. I could have ranked the Eagles much higher on this list, but ultimately what I came back to in terms of the Eagles is their level of competition, both in the regular season that they faced and in the playoffs, including a Super Bowl victory over one of the weaker Patriot teams in Super Bowl 52, a high-scoring affair, a miracle performance by Nick Foles. And on top of that, I just came back to, it was a Nick Foles-led team in the playoffs. Carson Wentz, in fact, was an MVP candidate. And maybe that speaks to the level of strength of the all-around roster, which at that time was the best in the NFL. There's no debate. This was a loaded roster at the time. But once you go back and reflect on the players that were on the team, it doesn't feel that way anymore. It feels like it was a team that had one incredible year, and on top of that, it was a rather weak season for the NFL in general. That Patriots team that they beat in the Super Bowl didn't have Dante Hightower, Julian Edelman. Brandon Cooks got injured in the first quarter. Malcolm Butler was sat on the bench for no reason. Matt Patricia had one of the worst game plans I've ever seen. And I feel like if you play that game a few more times, I'm not so sure that Tom Brady doesn't come out with the victory. And you're talking about an Eagles team that faced Case Keenum and the Vikings in the NFC Championship, a rather flawed offensive Atlanta Falcon team, and overall, during the regular season, they really faced no level of comp. They only played the Rams and the Panthers, who were other playoff teams in the NFC. That was Sean McVay and Jared Goff's first season together in 2017, and Cam Newton and Ron Rivera, well established in the NFL in the regular season. They beat both those teams. They did also lose to Kansas City in Kansas City that season with Alex Smith and with Andy Reid, of course. A pretty good Kansas City team, by the way. Seattle in Seattle with Russell Wilson still in his prime. Pete Carroll, difficult place to play, can understand that. And then Dallas, but that was with backups. So this team was legitimately 13-2 during the regular season. They were 13-3 overall because, yeah, they lost with their backups to the Dallas Cowboys. 6-0, actually. It was kind of a weird game. But this is a weird team to analyze because very good overall statistically, balanced across the board, although they didn't have a dominant unit in terms of like their pass offense, their rush offense, their rush defense, their pass defense, as it will reflect in the stats once we take a look. And the roster is really good for the time, but I don't know how many like legitimate Hall of Famers are on this team. So let's just take a look at their stats. So 5th and 3rd in points per drive, 5th offensively, 3rd defensively. They were very good on both sides of the football. Yards per drive, both top 10. Offensively, 10th, defensively, 5th. Passing yards, rushing yards, that's kind of where we talk about, okay, they weren't a dominant yardage football team, but they were great in terms of points, and that reflects in their passing yardage totals. They had a little bit of a weakness against the pass and a little bit of a weakness of sustaining consistency throwing the football. Rushing yards offensively was actually surprisingly only 24th. I think that's why they ended up trading for Jay Ajayi at some point during the season. And then they were also 3rd against the run, led by Fletcher Cox up front. That was always a good unit for them. They were 1st in scoring margin, which was important. They were 10.8 points better per game than their opponent, which is an impressive statistic, and I believe actually one of the better on this list. But again, going back to who was in the Final Four that season, right, guys? It was the New England Patriots against Blake Bortles and the Jacksonville Jags, a really good defensive team, but not a great team overall, right? The Vikings, Case Keenum, a good defensive team led by Zimmer, but not a great team overall. And the Eagles were able to, even without their quarterback, Carson Wentz, get to the Super Bowl. And Nick Foles got hot. He played really well, especially in the Vikings game and in the Super Bowl. He played maybe even better than Carson Wentz could in those moments. But that also showcased the versatility of this team, and I think why they won the Super Bowl. Because they were able to do it with their backup. They were able to do it no matter the quarterback, right? And I think a lot of that has to do with similar vibes to what this Eagles team did this year. They had a great offensive line led by Lane Johnson in his prime, Jason Kelsey in his prime, right? All pro caliber players, Brandon Brooks, and a forgotten member of this offensive line, 3 Pro Bowlers. They also had Zach Ertz in his prime, who was influential in the Super Bowl. Alshon Jeffrey, who they signed for that very purpose of going down the field. He also had a good Super Bowl. Nelson Aguilar in the slot. Torrey Smith was their complimentary perimeter receiver. LeGarrette Blount came over for New England for this season. They had Corey Clement as their receiving back and Jay Ajayi also as their complimentary back. They didn't really have a lot of holes offensively, but when you look at that overall skill position group, it's not the sexiest that you'll see on this list. It's, Jeffrey was good, but at this time, maybe a little bit past his absolute peak. Zach Ertz was probably their best skill player overall, and their running backs were kind of eh. And, Wentz and Foles Wentz was really good during the regular season. Like, some people would argue he was the MVP. I would not, because I think it was clearly Tom Brady. But Carson Wentz was doing historic things on 3rd down, a lot because of his protection was so good. He was great at, buying time and finding plays down the field and or scrambling on certain plays. And he was magical throughout the season. But it showcased that he wasn't really the most valuable player because Nick Foles took over and then ultimately won the Super Bowl. Their defense was good. I wouldn't call it great. It was led by Jim Schwartz at the time, who always runs a good defense. Frank Reich ran the offense, and this was a good coaching staff. Peterson, Reich, and Schwartz leading the way. Of course, they had some of the best positional coaches as well. Schwartz had a defensive line led by Brandon Graham at his peak, stripping the ball of Tom Brady in the Super Bowl. Of course, Chris Long was a nice addition to this defensive line in pass rushing situations. They had great depth as well. And then Fletcher Cox was their absolute stud on their defense, who just was wrecking every play imaginable. Bradham and Kendricks were their linebackers, 2 athletic guys, very underrated names. Malcolm Jenkins was a really good player for their back end, largely would take on tight ends and things in their defense. Rodney McLeod was also a part of that safety group. Patrick Robinson, Jalen Mills, and Ronald Darby were their corners, which was probably their weakness, but they had a strong defensive front, and they would often beat teams due to their pass rush and their ability to be balanced on offense. This was a good Super Bowl team. There's nothing you can really say to say that they were bad necessarily. It's just I feel like they kind of feasted on a weaker year of the NFL. They feasted on a weaker Patriot defense in the Super Bowl, despite Tom Brady's heroics. They faced a rather weak NFC, right? They didn't really have to take on a lot of premier quarterbacks even throughout the entire season. So that's kind of how I view them. Despite their great record, despite being third in points for, fourth in points against, starting 11-1, maybe I'm disrespecting this team. Maybe it's the quarterback for me. I'm not exactly sure, but history does not reflect on this team the same way that you felt about them at the moment, because it felt like they were really loaded at the moment, but you go back and you look at the roster itself like now, and you're kind of like, okay, Brandon Graham, Fletcher Cox, right? Maybe you throw in Malcolm Jenkins on defense. Zach Ertz, I guess you could give them Alshon Jeffrey, and then the offensive line. But I don't really see the historic members of this team like I feel like other teams have, all right? So let's move on to number 9. At number 9, I have the Denver Broncos from 2015. This was a team that is extremely hard to rank because they were all defense. This is one of the greatest defenses ever to play in the NFL. And some people might put them higher on this list for that very fact alone, but they were such a one-sided football team. And I would also say about the Broncos that they largely benefited from a beat-up path to the Super Bowl. A lot of their opponents were not at 100%, and I would also say that they were a sketchy team throughout the regular season, despite being the AFC's number 1 seed entering the playoffs. They also didn't have the greatest coaching staff, in my opinion. I would probably say that Clint Kubiak was the worst head coach on this list, in my opinion. Rick Dennison was their offensive coordinator, who's kind of a no-name, and defensive coordinator Wade Phillips kind of really led this team, once again, defensively. They were 12-4 during the regular season. They started off 8-0, and I'd probably say the best thing they did was they defeated the Patriots twice. Not once, but twice in Denver. That being said, in both of those games, the Patriots were very beat up. In the first game, they had none of their running backs and a bunch of their receivers were injured. And in the second game, their offensive line really was beat up. And Edelman had a broken ankle. They had no running backs left except for a 40-year-old Steven Jackson. So the Patriots were really beat up, somehow still got to the AFC Championship, but the Broncos defense really just was able to take control of that. You think about the playoffs, right? They beat the Steelers. And I guess you would call it the Killer Bees at the time. Le'Veon Bell, Antonio Brown. But that Steelers team was also missing key pieces to that team that made them successful as well. So it's hard to say that they really dominated their path to the Super Bowl victory. It felt like every game they won was really extremely excruciating, ugly. And it was almost a story of Peyton Manning. I don't know how he did it, but it was like a last ride. And Peyton Manning was barely putting any zip on that football. He was atrocious throughout the season. He had 9 touchdowns and 17 picks. And Peyton Manning was so bad that he was splitting time with Brock Osweiler, who also had some success, and they legitimately split time throughout the season. Peyton ultimately was the starter throughout the playoffs. This team also beat the Steelers during the playoffs. The Panthers is definitely their most impressive performance in the Super Bowl, considering the Panthers were 15-1, and at that time looking like a historic team, like dominant. Cam Newton was going off as the MVP, having one of the greatest seasons we had seen to that point, especially for a dual threat quarterback. The Panthers had one of the best defenses in football, if not the second best, behind the Seattle Seahawks. And I do think, though, the one thing about the Panthers is they were really flawed at wide receiver, and the Broncos took advantage of that. And they were one of the few teams that was able to hem in Cam Newton into the pocket and really get some pressure on him. And the Panthers were all built on Cam Newton's superhuman ability. And, the Panthers didn't have great receiving options. Like Ted Ginn was their number 1 receiver. Greg Olsen was great at tight end, but they didn't have a lot. It was really the defense and Cam that made that team go. And the Broncos were able to win a defensive battle because of it. But you look at their team, their roster, like it was really loaded. The thing is about the Broncos, they just didn't have a quarterback that season. Peyton fell off the face of the planet and still was able to win the Super Bowl. He had Demaryius Thomas, he had Emmanuel Sanders, both went for over 1,000 yards despite the quarterback play. They had Owen Daniels at tight end, who was still very competent, actually had 2 touchdowns in the AFC Championship. They had Hillman and Anderson at running back, probably their more underwhelming position there. The O-line was really solid overall, especially in the run game. Kubiak did help this team after they fired Fox and went after Kubiak. Kubiak was able to get the ground game going, which was important for the offense. Defensively, they really had one of the best rosters you'll ever construct, led by, of course, their corners, Aqib Talib and Chris Harris. They had Ward at safety was a standout for me. Danny Trevathan at linebacker was a standout for me. Their D-line was absolutely nuts. Malik Jackson in the middle. They had Von Miller at his peak. DeMarcus Ware on the other side. Shaq Barrett as the third rusher. Just an absolutely loaded front, and even a great run defense. I mean, when you look at their stats, it's no wonder they're one of the greatest run defenses of all time, or one of the greatest pass defenses, but one of the greatest defenses in general. So points per drive. Just look at the difference. 24 on offense and first on defense. Yards per drive, 23rd on offense, first on defense. 14th in pass yards on offense, first on defense. 17th on rushing offense, third on defense. They really were almost sweeping every single defensive category, which is almost unheard of nowadays in the NFL. But when you look at some of their dominance metrics like SRS rating, they were only 9th. This is a Pro Football Reference statistic that kind of indicates their point differential versus their level of competition played. Scoring margin was only 9th in the NFL that year, despite being Super Bowl champs at 4.3. So they were not dominant because they couldn't score, but they were able to beat pretty much everybody. The one game that stands out to me was the game against Aaron Rodgers and the Packers, where I believe Rodgers didn't even have 10 completions. He didn't even throw for 90 yards. He was completely stifled in that game by the Broncos. I respect this team a lot for what they accomplished, especially defensively, but I think compared to a lot of these other great teams, they were just so one-dimensional that it's hard to have them very high on the list. At number 8, I have the 2023 Kansas City Chiefs, the Super Bowl champs, previous to these Philadelphia Eagles, at number 8. The Chiefs were 11-6, one of the weaker records on the list. I believe the most losses of any team on this list, okay? They had the second best defense in football, but 15th in points for. This was more of a defensive-led team last season than an offensive-led team, despite Travis Kelce, Patrick Mahomes, and Andy Reid being on the offensive side of the football. They also just lost a lot of games. They lost 6 games, but they lost to Detroit in week 1. They lost to Denver just randomly to Russell Wilson. They lost to the Eagles, who faced them in the Super Bowl the previous season and got their revenge in Kansas City. They lost to Josh Allen and the Bills. They lost randomly to Aiden O'Connell on, I believe it was Christmas, and they lost to Jordan Love and the Packers in Green Bay on a Sunday night. They did beat quite a few good teams, though, which is where the argument for the Chiefs can be put over the Broncos or the Eagles. The level of competition faced, in my opinion, in this season was stronger because they beat a talented offense in Miami in the cold. They dominated them. Tua, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Mike McDaniel, all that sort of stuff. That's not really one of the more impressive wins, but they did beat them twice, including a game in Germany. They beat the Bills in the playoffs with Josh Allen. Although it took a missed kick and half the defense being injured, they still beat Josh Allen, who is probably the best quarterback that season, in my opinion. They did beat the Baltimore Ravens, the best defense in the NFL that season, in the AFC Championship, on the road in Buffalo, on the road in Baltimore, on the road versus the best quarterback, on the road versus the best defense. And then in the Super Bowl, they played the best offense, okay? And they beat the 49ers. So they were able to win, mostly through their defense, but they were able to beat all these different teams with all these different great lineups and different strengths. So that's really impressive. And a lot of that has to do with their coaching staff, Andy Reid, Steve Spagnuolo leading the way. This team, of course, the differences, in my opinion, between this team and the team we saw in the Super Bowl that fell to the Eagles, L'Jarius Sneed at cornerback was a big factor for them, which made their secondary one of the best I've seen over the last decade plus. They had Snead. They had, of course, McDuffie locking down on the outside. O'Menihue was much better up front for them. He had 7 sacks. Mike Dana was also a much better player up front for them with 6.5 sacks. Those two players gave competent backup secondary pass rushing options that complemented Chris Jones and George Karlaftis. They had 4 starting caliber linebackers, including Bolton, Tranquil, Gay, and Chanel. Okay. Wide receiver wise, Rashee Rice ended up having a great playoffs. Isaiah Pacheco gave them a competent running game in the backfield. And Travis Kelce was still very much in playoff form. He had one of the best playoff campaigns we've ever seen last playoffs. Maybe it was really started from Swift, but I feel like Travis Kelce finished it off in a great way. And they were able to get by with their offense, but Mahomes was just playing, clutch, really good game management style of football. And you take a look at some of their stats where they don't really wow you, but it goes to show that they were a fairly balanced team and they could win through a lot of close games, right? Points per drive, 10th offensively, 3rd defensively, and they're pretty much stronger in every defensive metric compared to offensive. You just look at it, right? Points per drive, 3rd defensively compared to 10th offensively. You got 6th defensively compared to 8th offensively in yards per drive, but still top 10 in both, which is impressive. Top 6 in pass offense and defense, 4th defensively, 6th offensively. Rushing yards, they were not very competent on either side. They were actually much weaker this season in terms of in 2023 rather than 2024 against the run. They ranked only 18th, but they did stand up to Christian McCaffrey and Lamar Jackson when they needed to in those big playoff games, and they're only 19th offensively running the ball. Their SRS was rather weak at 7th, indicating that they did not differentiate from a lot of teams. They did not get a lot of big victories at only 3.75. Their scoring margin as well, 5th in the NFL at only 5 points on average was their margin of victory, or their scoring margin in general. So the Kansas City Chiefs of 2023, just a very well-coached team, situationally very aware, extremely clutch, and they did play a level of competition where they had to go on the road, they had to beat Lamar, they had to beat Josh, they had to beat the Niners in the Super Bowl. That is what stands out about their run, and that's why they're at number 8. At number 7, I have the 2021 Los Angeles Rams, a team that was very hard for me to rank because on one side, I see some of the deficiencies. I see where maybe they got a little fortunate on the teams they were able to play in the playoffs and how it stacked up for them and how they were able to get on this great run. But at the same time, I look at some of the talent that they had and some of the pieces, especially defensively, they were able to coordinate, and it really came together with a historic wide receiver season. Matt Stafford on a tear in the playoffs and just unbelievable clutch throws. And Sean McVay having the best overall team of his career. So the 2021 Rams were 12-5, led by Sean McVay as their head coach and 2 now head coaches of their own right. Kevin O'Connell on the offensive side, Raheem Morris on the defensive side, which is impressive. Now, they did benefit, in my opinion, from their path because they didn't have to play Josh Allen and the Bills in 2021, who were dynamic and just awesome. Like, I felt like that could have been the team to win the Super Bowl. No Chiefs because, the Chiefs lost to the Bengals, and the Chiefs kind of blew that game against the Bengals. So no Mahomes, no Josh Allen. They didn't have to play either one. And the Bucs in which they played were not the same team. Right? They had lost a lot of players that season, including on the offensive line, which allowed Von Miller and Aaron Donald and Leonard Floyd to feast against Tom Brady for a majority of the game. They had multiple offensive linemen injured. Antonio Brown threw his helmet against the Jets. Chris Godwin tore his ACL. So they were missing quite a few pieces, that Tampa Bay team that I felt like was probably better at full strength. So no Josh Allen, no Tom Brady, no Patrick Mahomes, probably 3 of the 4 best teams in the league. And the Green Bay Packers were eliminated, a team they lost to during the regular season. They were eliminated by the 49ers, who had Jimmy Garoppolo. So despite the 49ers beating the Rams twice, and that being a tough matchup for the Rams, I do give them credit for going and winning at home and winning the NFC Championship and beating the Niners finally, enabling them to win the Super Bowl. I respect all that, but at the same time, they didn't have to beat Aaron Rodgers, and they didn't have to beat Brady's team at full strength. They didn't have to beat Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen. They were able to play Joe Burrow, who was only in his second year, and it was kind of a fluky Bengals team. And it's just like the way that things lined up for the Rams was very, very exquisite for them, okay? They did lose to the Cardinals, who were a playoff team during the regular season, Tennessee, who was AFC's number 1 seed, the 49ers twice, and the number 1 seed in the NFC. So every team they lost to was very, very good, right? The 2 number 1 seeds, the 49ers, who were a playoff team and went to the NFC Championship, and the Cardinals, who they played in the wild card. Okay, so every team they played was really, really good. Or every team they lost to was really, really good. So there's nothing to really complain about there. They also won 5 straight before losing to the 49ers in week 18, which also goes to show that the Rams weren't like a team that absolutely peaked at the right time, because they lost the week 18 game against the 49ers to allow the 49ers to get to the playoffs. But that ended up helping them, because the 49ers were able to beat the Cowboys and then beat the Packers, which allowed the Rams to not go on the road in the snow and play the Packers or on the road in the cold against the Packers, and allowed them to get to the Super Bowl, right? So that's kind of interesting how that worked out. But, and they also won every single game close. They beat the Niners 20-17, the Bucs 30-27, where Brady nearly came back. They actually tied the game at 27. They beat the Bengals 23-20 on a last-minute drive. But the roster was loaded, and by the end of the year, it was clear that they were a Super Bowl caliber roster. Matt Stafford was playing really well. They had OBJ complementing Cooper Kupp when OBJ could still play. Robert Woods was their number 3, who, was a compliment out there as well. I believe he might have gotten hurt by the end of the year, if I'm not mistaken. Van Jefferson also was pretty good that season. He actually had the most yards of his career. I think he had around 800 yards. Tyler Higbee was probably more in his prime. Andrew Whitworth and Havenstein were their right and left tackles. Really good combo at those positions. Their defense was really underrated. Their front 7 was awesome. They had Aaron Donald, Leonard Floyd, Von Miller, Sebastian Joseph Day, Greg Gaines, Ashawn Robinson, a really deep defensive line that could get after it and could stop the run. And they had Jalen Ramsey and Darius Williams at corner locking it down. So the Rams did have some holes. Like their interior O-line, running back featured Sony Michel and Henderson. They had a couple holes overall, but they had great coaching staff at all levels. They had a dominant pass rush, a really good passing game with Cooper Kupp playing at a historic level and OBJ complimenting him. And overall, that was enough to get it done against, again, the schedule just worked out for them and in favor. Despite being, I think, a 4 seed, they were able to get the Super Bowl in a pretty interesting way. So, yeah. This is a good team to talk about in the comments. So let me know what you guys think about the 2021 Rams. Let's take a look at them from a statistical standpoint. The Rams. All right. So statistically, I think they might be like the weakest team from a regular season statistic standpoint that we've looked at so far. Like, clearly pass defense at 22nd, rush offense at 25th, 19th in points per drive defensively. Those are things that do stand out. But I will say about the 2021 Rams, again, they kind of peaked at the right time in terms of just their roster came together. Like, they were able to add Von Miller. They were able to add OBJ. They made late season additions to their team that put them over the top and made them a powerhouse. So it's hard to really reflect on their stats because of how the roster came into form at that point, right? Their SRS was 6th. Their scoring margin was only 6th. So they were seen as like a good team during the regular season, but quite flawed. And they weren't on the level of the elite teams. Like, they had lost to all of the best teams: Green Bay, Tennessee, San Francisco. And again, they didn't play the Bills. They didn't play the Chiefs. The only real great team they beat in the regular season was Tampa Bay. So, and they seemingly have a little bit of a coaching mismatch there. So the Rams good Super Bowl champion team, very talented. I prefer Stafford definitely over 2015 Peyton, Nick Foles. I think their roster is comparable to the 2017 Eagles, despite how stacked it was. I feel like they have more overall talent than the Chiefs and at least respectable level of coaching to be able to give them the edge there. I just think they're a little bit more talented. And they were able to shine. You know, Stafford was able to be clutch even against Tom Brady, even against Joe Burrow. So you got to give them credit for that. And they slayed their demons of the 49ers. At number 6, I went with the 2022 Kansas City Chiefs. This was a team led by Andy Reid, Eric Bieniemy, and Steve Spagnuolo. People forget about the Eric Bieniemy influence of the Chiefs, and seemingly, since he's left, the Chiefs haven't exactly been the same offensive team. But this was the last time the Chiefs had a great offense. They were the best offense in football, leading the NFL in points. They were 14-3 as a team. They finished 8-0 after losing a game to guess who? The Cincinnati Bengals in the regular season. And week 7 and on, they won every single game except for one against the Bengals. They also had a random loss early in the year to the Colts, which just made no sense. They lost to the Bills, Josh Allen, and Joe Burrow, the Bengals. So really, other than the random Colts loss, they lost to Josh Allen and Joe Burrow. That's respectable. They beat the 49ers, who went to the NFC Championship and looked like the best team in the league by the end of the year, led by Brock Purdy. This was actually Jimmy Garoppolo's 49ers at the time. They beat Tom Brady and Tampa Bay in his final season. They were a playoff team, but not a very good one. And they beat Jacksonville, who was also a playoff team that they defeated in the divisional round, 27-20. The other thing about the Chiefs that kind of go back and forth with is this was a year where they were really good offensively, but they don't really have the talent on paper that indicates that they were dominant. I think their O-line was the best that it's been over the last 3 years, including their back-to-back Super Bowl championship wins, because they had Orlando Brown at left tackle. Joe Thuney was more so in his absolute prime. Creed Humphrey was at center playing really well, and they had 3 Pro Bowlers at those 3 spots on the left. While they did have Donovan Smith, not Donovan Smith, Trey Smith. Donovan Smith played for their 2023 team. Andrew Wiley was their right tackle, who is solid. I mean, him and Jawan Taylor are probably comparable. But Trey Smith was very good, but not quite a Pro Bowl level player at that point, but still very good. So they had a really good 4 out of 5 on their offensive line. That made up for the lack of wide receiver talent. But Juju actually played extremely well for this offense this season, including in the Super Bowl. Travis Kelce had one of his best seasons ever in 2022. I think he had like 1,300 yards and 110 catches or something crazy like that. Hardman was contributing a little bit. Gray, Tony, MVS were all complementary pieces. This was Pacheco's breakout rookie season. Jerick McKinnon was a very good receiving back for them as well. So those were all pieces. I like this defense, although they didn't analytically look like the 2023 unit. By the end of the year, they were one of the better defenses in my opinion, and I liked their depth. They had Snead and McDuffie on the outside at corner, Fenton and Williams as their 3 and their 4. Thornhill, Justin Reed, and Cook were 3 really solid safeties that all complemented each other well. They had 3 linebackers in Bolton, Gay, and Chanel, and their defensive line, Chris Jones, Karlaftis. This was the best defensive line I think they've had over the last 3 years. Jones, Karlaftis, Frank Clark, Mike Dana, and Carlos Dunlap even had like 4 sacks that year. So I actually like that D-line more than 2023 or 2022. I even liked Thornhill at the secondary level at safety as well in comparison to the 2023-2024. I do feel like the 2023 team had better corners overall, and the linebackers were better, and the overall like scheme understanding was better under Spags. But to me, this was the best team because they still had a level of explosion over the last 3, I should say. This team had a level of explosion. This team still had a good defense situationally. They were able to work off of an explosive offense rather well, and they had a good game plan in the Super Bowl, I would say. 2022, let's take a look at the statistics for the Chiefs. So they were first in points and yards per drive offensively. Defensively, though, their numbers aren't as good as I feel like they played at the end of the year. 21st in points per drive defensively, 11th in yards per drive defensively, 18th in passing yards allowed, 8th in rushing yards allowed, though. 20th in rush yards offensively. Again, they were a little bit better in terms of their scoring margin in comparison to 2023, 7.0, which was 5th in the NFL. Their SRS was 6th. So again, another Chiefs team that isn't exactly dominant, does feel like it had some flaws, does feel like it was more about coaching. Patrick Mahomes, the O-line was really good. They had a situationally good defense, but this was not a dominant roster or a dominant team. So that's why they're hard to rank, because they were very clutch, but I have them at 6. I definitely feel this was a better team than 2023. Even though the 2023 team played better competition, this team was just much better on offense. And I feel like, yes, the 2023 team was better on defense, but the 2022 team situationally and near the end of the season was pretty good on defense. So that's where I give them the lean at number 6. They're also 14-3. I mean, that's a pretty impressive record too. So at number 6, I got the 22 Chiefs. I will just finish it off with the Chiefs in terms of saying the playoff run wasn't overly impressive, because I don't think that season had a lot of competition. The Bengals had no offensive line in the AFC Championship, and the Bengals nearly beat the Chiefs, but that's always a matchup issue for them. The team they beat in the divisional round was Jacksonville, who we've seen how they've performed since. And the Super Bowl was the Eagles, and the Eagles very well could have won if not for the refs and a couple of big plays from the special teams and things like that the Chiefs were able to get. But 38-35 over a talented Eagles team that it felt like the Eagles might have even lost to the Niners if Brock Purdy doesn't get injured. Like, I wonder how that would have worked out. But so it was kind of a sketchy year for the NFL. Like, the Eagles didn't really play any competition like the entire season. They beat up on the Giants and like just not very good teams. So it was kind of hard to say who the Chiefs really beat that was a really great team, because there weren't a lot of them. But I have them at number 6 here. At number 5, I've got my 2018 New England Patriots, the final 6th Super Bowl ring of the Patriots, the most recent, where they were led by Bill Belichick, Josh McDaniels, and Brian Flores as their head coach and offensive and defensive coordinators. They were only 11-5 during the regular season, but this is the definition of peaking at the right time. And this was a team that did seem to play a lot of competition in the big moments, including a 2018 historically great Kansas City Chief offense that they walked into Arrowhead and won in overtime 37-31. They dominated a 12-4 Charger team that nearly won their division 41-28, and that score does not do it justice. It was like a blowout completely. And in the Super Bowl, they dominated one of the best offenses over the last 10 years. The 2018 Rams, led by Jared Goff, Sean McVay calling plays, and a historic Todd Gurley. They were 13-3, and the Patriots never really felt like they were going to lose that game. And although it was a 2-score victory, it was a grind and a really ugly watch. The Patriots dominated a Rams offense that had not been stopped all season. So some of the feats the Patriots were able to have this season was truly impressive. And it felt like every time they played a big game during 2018, they won, including against the Chiefs in the regular season on a Sunday night. They lost some really weird games during the 2018 season. I think they lost every game to a team that didn't make the playoffs. It's kind of a weird stat, but they lost to Tennessee and Tennessee randomly. They lost to Jacksonville in week 2 in Jacksonville. They lost 2, really early games, Jacksonville and Detroit, which hurt them early in the season. They lost a Miami Miracle that they definitely shouldn't have lost in Miami, but they always tend to do. I was at the game that they lost to Pittsburgh. It was an ugly football game. They lost the Miami and Pittsburgh game in back-to-back outings, which was extremely rare for the Patriots at that time. But it also was about the state of the team. They had to kind of find their identity. They had to find the Patriot formula that they wanted to put out there in the playoffs, and they started to lean on the run game a little bit more, their offensive line, which I felt like was one of the most underrated we've seen over the last 10 years. I think this Patriots offensive line was really, really solid. It featured Joe Thuney, Shaq Mason, Dave Andrews, Trent Brown at left. I can't recall who played the right. Was it Marcus Cannon? If anyone remembers, let me know. I feel bad as a Patriots fan. I want to say it was Marcus Cannon, but I could be wrong about that. But I remember Trent Brown being an absolute animal, taking over for Nate Solder after he left the Giants. That interior trio was the best in football at the time, and their defense was phenomenal. Their defense had great linebackers and a great secondary. By the end of the year, they really peaked. The secondary was able to play man-to-man across the board against anybody. They had Stephon Gilmore, who at this time was the best corner in football, John Jones in the nickel spot, Devin McCourty, Jason McCourty, Patrick Chung, J.C. Jackson as their number 2 outside corner, Daron Harmon as their free safety. They had Trey Flowers up front, who was a good pass rusher. Kyle Van Noy, Dante Hightower, Landon Roberts, and Jawan Bentley at linebacker was a deep and hybrid unit of linebackers. And this was a very fun defense to watch because of the linebackers, the aggression, the man coverage, the classic style of Brian Flores that we came to know and love. And their running backs were a key component to this team. Sony Michel, as his rookie season, was very good in the playoffs. James White was phenomenal, actually led the team in receptions this season with like 80 plus. Cordell Patterson was a receiver and a running back. This was the first year he kind of became a running back. Rex Burkhead was also very key and critical against the Chiefs and a good player overall that could do everything. He was also good in the Super Bowl. Edelman was at his best in the Super Bowl. He was Super Bowl MVP. Gronk had kind of deteriorated due to injuries and things, but was still good. Josh Gordon was on the team for a brief period of time, but left near the end, and Chris Hogan and Philip Dorsett filled in for them. Not the best receiving core for Brady, and this was not Brady's best season by his standards, but he was very good in the playoffs when he needed to be and needed to be at his best. But this was mostly about their defense, their running game, and Brady being clutch in a lot of the moments. Especially against Kansas City. But, you know, that was a lot because they just didn't have great receiving weapons at that time. So looking at the 2018 Patriots from a numbers standpoint, we have the Patriots 8th in points per drive on offense, 7th on defense, a well-rounded football team from that standpoint. Yardage, 9th and 11th, so both in the top 10 in both categories, which is good. Passing yards, weirdly 22nd on defense, which it definitely didn't feel like it. And then 8th on offense, still in the top 10 from a passing standpoint. But the offense was very balanced. They just weren't elite at really anything, right? They were 8th in passing yards, 5th in rushing yards. They could run the ball. This was a big season for Josh McDaniels in the power running game. They're also 11th against the run. They were 5th in scoring margin at 7.4 points, 8th in SRS at 5.18. So the New England Patriots, led by Super Bowl MVP Julian Edelman, very well-rounded team. No real standout flaws about their team, but not a lot of strengths. I would probably look at Brady, the O-line, and the secondary as the strengths of this Patriot team. But like I said, just an extremely clutch team. Every single time they played a good team, it felt like they came out on top, but they weirdly lost to a bunch of bad teams. I don't know what that says about them, but maybe they just didn't take it very seriously. At number 4, I have the team that I believe is the best from this Chiefs dynasty. That is the 2019 Kansas City Chiefs, their first Super Bowl victory with Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. This team was led by Reid, Bieniemy, and Spags. And the difference between 2018 with their historic offense and 2019 is it felt like they still had a good amount of that 2018 magic offensively, especially in the playoffs with the explosion and the comebacks. But their defense was much better, led by Steve Spagnuolo. And they went through that defensive coordinator change. They became a lot better in key moments, despite having similar personnel, but making some critical changes. So they were 12-4 during the regular season. They did start 7-4 and looked kind of during the regular season, but then they went 8-0 after the bye week and went on an absolute tear. Patrick Mahomes also missed 2 games during the season where they went 1-1. I think Matt Moore was the quarterback that took over for those games. They lost to the Colts for some reason. Again, they lose to the Colts weirdly all the time. They lost to the Texans and Deshaun Watson, who were a playoff team. We'll get to that. They lost to the Packers and Aaron Rodgers. They lost to the Tennessee Titans, who are also an AFC Championship representative. But interesting enough, right? They beat every great team that season except for Green Bay, right? So this is where I really like the 2019 Chiefs. Even in the teams that they lost to, right? The Texans and the Titans. They played the Texans and the Titans in the playoffs. They beat both of them. They beat Houston 51-31 after falling behind. I think it was 24-0. They beat Tennessee 35-24 after they lost to them in the regular season. And then they beat the 49ers, a really good roster, especially defensively, 31-20. The score was it was closer than that because the Niners were up by 10 and then the Chiefs got a late touchdown, but they still won 31-20, which goes to show their explosion, right? Their level of explosiveness. 51-31 after being behind 24-0. That just speaks for itself, right? Putting up 35 on Tennessee. They were able to just score. When they were hot, they were sizzling, right? And again, I respect the fact that they were able to beat every good team they faced except for Green Bay. They didn't get a second opportunity at Green Bay because San Francisco wiped the floor with Green Bay in the NFC Championship. But the Chiefs did beat Baltimore during that season, the team that was the number 1 seed. That makes me believe they would have beat them again in the AFC Championship. They beat New England in New England. Despite the refs maybe getting the N'Keal Harry out of bounds call wrong, they still beat them. They beat San Francisco, who's the best team in the NFC. They beat Houston. They beat Tennessee. So every single team they faced, they kind of beat them. So that's where you talk about level of competition. You talk about even redeeming losses. That's where you start to begin with a great team, okay? And then you look at the roster. I think this was the best well-rounded group of roster talent. They had a lot of talent in their skill positions. They had Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, Sammy Watkins, Mecole Hardman, Demarcus Robinson, who's still playing in the NFL at a fairly high level. Damian Williams was a pretty good running back that year. Shady McCoy was their backup. And then defensively, they had Chris Jones kind of entering his peak, Frank Clark, who was in his peak, Ogba as a complimentary defensive end who was playing his best football of his career. Okafor was a solid rotation piece. Even Terrell Suggs was coming off the bench. They had Anthony Hitchens, who was solid. I believe it was it Damian Wilson, who was the other linebacker? I can't quite recall what his name was. But Wilson was the other linebacker. They had Charvarius Ward and Kendall Fuller at corner in the secondary. Tyrann Mathieu was really good for them at safety. Juan Thornhill was still there. And Sorensen, who was one of their weaknesses, but he was their third safety. So the Kansas City Chiefs of 2019, man, I just love the complement of solid defensive talent, very good defensive scheme. Not quite as good as their defenses from 2023 or even 2024 probably, but much better offense, much more explosive, much more able to take advantage of opponents, much more able to blow out opponents, right? This is something that I think matters in terms of historic legacy. So you're talking about the 2019 Chiefs, second in points per drive. I think they were only behind the Ravens, 15th in points per drive defensively, third in yards per drive offensively, 23rd in defense, fifth in pass yards on offense, eighth in pass yards on defense, which goes to show they were top 10 in passing defense. So they would get the lead and they would shut you down after. Rushing, they were weak on both sides. That was kind of their weakness, but they were able to run the ball in the Super Bowl. So there's that. SRS, 9.14, which was fourth. That's a pretty high number. And a 9.7 scoring margin, which was fourth in the NFL, which is very high for fourth, by the way. But also, I would say that was by far their highest out of their Super Bowl champs, 9.7, if you compare it to the 2022 Chiefs or the 2023 Chiefs. So they just generally blew out more teams. They were able to come back in games with like a relentless mayhem. Yeah, this was my favorite Chief team to watch because I felt like they were still awesome on offense, but they had a capable defense that could complement it. They were well coached. Mahomes was playing fun football. Tyreek was on the team, blazing fast. Travis Kelce was dealing over the middle, and they had a defense led by Chris Jones, Tyrann Mathieu, a few playmakers across the board. So, yeah, this was a good team. I put them at number 4 on my list. At number 3, I've got the 2024 Philadelphia Eagles. The Philadelphia Eagles, I almost put at number 2. We'll kind of explain the differences once we get to number 2. This team was awesome this past season. They were one of the most balanced football teams we've seen over the last 20 years. Really, when you're talking about passing offense, rushing defense, passing defense, when you're talking about coaching staff, there's very few things about this Eagles team that were vulnerable. There's very few things you could attack. There's very few things you could lean on in terms of, we're going to push these buttons and that's how we're going to get to them and that's how we're going to beat them. They are very reminiscent of the 2013 Seahawks or the 2014 Seahawks in this fashion where it's like, I'm not really sure how you beat this team. Like, they're so dominant at the line of scrimmage. They've got, a capable quarterback in clutch situations. They've got really good defense, so good coaching staff. So it's like the Eagles, they're not as good at quarterback as some of these teams. They're not as good as Mahomes and the Chiefs. They're not as good as Brady and the Patriots, but they're still good enough. They've got maybe the best O-line on this entire list. The second best O-line might be the other Eagles team, to be honest. This team didn't have Jason Kelce, but, they had Mailata, who was phenomenal. Probably an upgrade at tackle, right? And the thing that's weird to figure out with this Eagles team is how will the defense age and some of their younger pieces. That's going to be interesting to find out. Like, okay, how does Nolan Smith age throughout his career? Jalen Carter age, Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, Zach Bond, and a breakout season. If these guys grow and indicate that they're regular Pro Bowlers, regular All-Pros, Hall of Famers, this will only grow the legacy of the team. Part of the problem with the Eagles in ranking them already is that we don't have a lot of time in sitting with the legacy of this team, and that's part of the issue, and maybe why I only have them at 3 and not 2, but I definitely wouldn't put them at 1, but I think you can make an argument for 2. They didn't have a pass rusher with 10 sacks, which is a random stat, but it's kind of like, it goes to show that they were very good in the secondary, locked people up with coverage, and they were able to dominate up front because of that, but also, they had a very deep rotation of rushers when it came to Nolan Smith really coming on at the end, Jalen Carter being the biggest beast of them all, Milton Williams being super underrated. They had Brandon Graham throughout the season, a veteran who was a part of their first Super Bowl team. They had a guy like Hunt come on for them. They had Zach Bond break out of nowhere. They had, Darius Slay, still a steady veteran. They had rookies that were excellent. Quinyon, Cooper DeJean. Josh Sweat was still playing at a high level. So they had very few flaws on defense. Jalen Hurts did not have his best season throughout the year, but when he had to step up in the playoffs against Washington and Kansas City, he delivered his 2 best games of the season in the 2 biggest moments of the season. They had a historic season, speaking of seasons, from their running back Saquon Barkley. 2,000 yards from Saquon Barkley, behind the best offensive line in the NFL this season. Lane Johnson, Jordan Mailata, Mekhi Becton, Landon Dickerson Pro Bowl level player. Juergens Hill's legacy will grow. 2 awesome number 1 caliber receivers, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, a really good tight end in Dallas Goedert. Just very few flaws on the resume of the roster. When you look at the stats, let's see how those are backed up here. So the Eagles, 8th in points per drive offensively, 2nd defensively, yards 11th and 1st. So as good as they have been, we've seen other teams with top 10 in both for yards and points. And the Eagles didn't quite get there at 11th, but they did have a number 2 and a number 1 next to their defense. So it is one of the better defenses on this list, I would argue. Outside of the 2015 Broncos, I think that you could put them up with any other defense on this list, including the 2023 Chiefs. That would be a close conversation. The rushing yards, 2nd for their offense, 10th for the defense. The only real flaw is their passing offense, and the volume wasn't there. So it's kind of hard to say that they should be higher, but they were 1st on defense. Their SRS was 5th at 7.69. Their scoring margin 2nd at 10.9, only behind the Lions. The Lions were actually near 11.1, but 10.9 is really, really excellent, as we've indicated, if you go back and compare it to the rest of the teams on this list. So their scoring margin was very, very good. They dominated and destroyed teams regularly because of their talent. Now, looking at their resume from this season, they beat the Packers twice, who are a playoff team, once in the playoffs, once in week 1. They beat the Rams on Sunday night. They beat them in the divisional round in a Snow Bowl. They beat Washington twice. And in both games that they had Jalen Hurts for all 60 minutes. That was the team that went to the NFC Championship. They destroyed Kansas City. They beat the Steelers, a playoff team. They beat Lamar, a playoff team, and arguably the MVP or the second best player in the league this year. They destroyed Joe Burrow, arguably the best passer in football this year. So there was plenty of competition compared to their 2017 team. Maybe they didn't play Buffalo, Houston, Minnesota, Detroit. There were some teams they didn't play, but they did play a fair amount of competition, especially within their own conference, and prove that they could dominate those teams. They did lose to Atlanta, but that was on a Saquon drop. They did lose to Washington, but that was on a Devontae Smith drop. And they didn't lose a single game in the season in which they had their receivers, Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. They lost to Tampa because of that as well. They did get blown out. That was a weird game for them. They lost 0 games with all their playmakers. 7th in points for, 2nd in points against, a really good team. Beyond passing yards, no statistical weakness at all. Very good team, led by Nick Sirianni, Kellen Moore, and Vic Fangio defensively, who was the X factor. Now, the number 2 team of the last 10 years is the 2020 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The 2020 Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I might be a little bit biased, but this is one of my favorite teams of all time. It's personal to me because this was the team in which Tom Brady signed with after he left the New England Patriots. And I made it my mission to understand this team at a deep level in which I don't think I've ever replicated throughout the course of my life as a football fan. This team I knew everything about before they took a snap, even though I was not a fan of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers before that. And this team ended up having a historic season and one of the greatest playoff runs we have ever seen. And this is a team that, yes, they did not have the record of the Eagles or maybe a previous Chiefs team. They were 11-5 in the regular season, and they started 7-5. But what you have to understand is that this was the team during the wackiest, weirdest offseason and NFL season that you've ever seen. And because they added so many new pieces to the team, it took them a long time because they didn't have practice to really get acclimated to what this team was going to become and be, right? They added Tom Brady. They added Antonio Brown. They added Rob Gronkowski. They added Leonard Fournette. They added Shady McCoy. They added Tristan Wirfs. They added Antoine Winfield. They added these pieces, and it's like, it's going to take time for them to get up to speed. It took quite a bit of time for Arians, Leftwich, and Brady to find the right rhythm of the offense, and that's totally understandable, okay? So that's where I don't really disqualify them from being at this spot because it was supposed to take time. And by the end of the year, they had one of the best runs you would ever see. So they went 7-5, but they won 8 straight after that. Not 5 straight, 8 straight. Okay. And the teams they lost to during the regular season were all good teams. They lost to New Orleans twice. A very good Saints team. This was probably the best defense Drew Brees had ever had during a season. And it was still a Sean Payton, Drew Brees offense with Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara. And this was a team that just flat out outcoached the Bucs twice in the regular season. They lost to a Chicago team that made the playoffs, and that was the one where Brady went like this, and they were trying to figure things out. It was early in the season. They lost to the Rams, who made the playoffs, and lost in the first round, but they made the playoffs, okay? And they lost to the Chiefs at home, the number 1 seed in the AFC. They got their revenge later in the year. That was a big learning game for them as well. That was still relatively early in the season. So then you look at who they beat. They beat Green Bay twice, the number 1 seed in the NFC. They smoked them the first time in Tampa Bay. Then they beat them pretty completely in the NFC Championship. The Packers sort of scored late to kind of make that a 1-score game. But the Bucs did win that fairly convincingly through their offense and their defense. New Orleans, they beat in New Orleans, a team that they lost to twice, the number 2 seed in the NFC, and they hammered Kansas City in a dominant fashion, a Chiefs team that had won the Super Bowl the year previous and was going for a back-to-back, was going for a repeat. Okay. So that was a like borderline historic Chiefs team at the same time, despite losing some of their offensive linemen before the Super Bowl. And the Chiefs had hammered the Bills the week before. I have a good Bills team. So yeah, and then they survived Taylor Heineke, which was a weird game, but they beat them too. And they scored 30 points in every single playoff game. 31 against Washington, 30-20 over New Orleans, which was convincing, 31-26 over Green Bay, 31-9 over Kansas City. Just like Philadelphia hammered the Chiefs and convincingly defeated their opponent in the Super Bowl. But you look at the roster and you look at how well-rounded this team was. Obviously, Tom Brady still playing at an extremely high level, I believe leading the NFL in big-time throws in the year 2020. They had Leonard Fournette, who was a good running back, Ronald Jones, who was pretty good himself, and Shady McCoy at running back, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Antonio Brown, Scotty Miller at wide receiver, Rob Gronkowski, Cam Brate, and O.J. Howard at tight end, Donovan Smith at his best at left tackle. This O-line was really good. Donovan Smith, Ali Marpet, who's a borderline all-pro. Ryan Jensen, same thing. Alex Kappa, capable, and Tristan Wirfs as a rookie at right tackle, good player. JPP and Shaq on the edges with Levante David and Devin White at linebacker. Vita Vea at nose tackle. Ndamukong Suh, still awesome. William Golston. Antoine Winfield at safety with Mike Edwards and Jordan Whitehead. Jamel Dean, Carlton Davis, and Sean Murphy-Bunting. Maybe one of the more inconsistent aspects of the team, but Davis and Dean had their good moments for sure. So, yeah, 11-5 does not do this team justice because of what they had to go through in order to get to where they wanted to go. So looking at them statistically, you would understand why. Okay, so the Bucs were first in scoring margin that season, despite being an 11-5 football team at 9.1. They were also second in SRS at 9.39 and seemingly played every good team during that season. Other than like the Bills, I think they played like every team imaginable during the regular season. The yards per drive, 13 and 6. The points, 5 and 6. The passing yards offensively second. So they had this great balance of having an incredible passing offense and an incredible run defense, where they were first in run defense. They were dominant, almost historic, led by Todd Bowles' run defense. And they had a great passing offense with Brady and these receivers second, even though it took a little bit of time. And they obviously were great on both sides, 5th and 6th in points. So the Bucs were a very well-rounded team, and that showcased in the Super Bowl and in the playoffs. And it was kind of funny how people were surprised by their success because everyone knew watching the Bottom Line View how talented they were. But the number one team over the last 10 years in the NFL, and I think this is pretty easily, by the way, this is by a decent margin, in my opinion, because they cover all aspects, and that is the 2016 New England Patriots. This is, in my opinion, one of the greatest teams of all time. I don't necessarily think because of the talent necessarily, although we'll get into the roster and it being a pretty darn solid roster, especially for a salary cap age team. But this team essentially lost one game with Tom Brady, and it was on the last play of the game. So they nearly went undefeated with their actual quarterback. They had to go through a little bit of off the field struggles with the Deflategate controversy and the suspension to Tom Brady early, which did lose them a game against the Buffalo Bills with their third string quarterback, Jacoby Brissett. But at the same time, they dominated the Miami Dolphins, who were an average team that year with Jimmy Garoppolo. They beat a NFC Championship representative the year previous, the Arizona Cardinals, in the first game of the year with Jimmy Garoppolo. And they also destroyed a playoff team with Jacoby Brissett in the Houston Texans. So that is really impressive. They were first in points against that season, the Patriots, despite not even being the best side of the football. Their offense was better than their defense, and they were first in points against. They had a better offensive line, in my opinion, than their previous Super Bowl champion of 2014, featuring Nate Solder at the left, Marcus Cannon on the right, Tooney, Andrews, and Mason on the inside. which was much better than their 2014 offensive line. Where they did get hurt was obviously Rob Gronkowski got hurt. He missed the Super Bowl, the playoffs. But if with Gronk, this team would have been ridiculously dominant, but they did miss him for about half the season. But they had Edelman, who was cooking in his prime. Chris Hogan, who this was probably the best season he ever played with the Patriots. Malcolm Mitchell, who was a surprising rookie. Danny Amendola stepping up in the clutch. They had Blunt being the best he's ever been in the NFL. 18 touchdowns, which led the NFL in rushing touchdowns, 1,161 yards. They had a competent running game because of that. James White was an excellent receiver and just peaking in his NFL career. And like I said, they had the number one defense in points allowed, led by Trey Flowers, Chris Long, Jabel Sheard, and Ninkovich on the defensive line, with Brown and Branch on the inside at D tackle. Their linebackers were nice. Jamie Collins, Dante Hightower, Kyle Van Noy, Alandon Roberts, Shane McClellan. Their corners were deep with Butler, Ryan, Rowe, and Jonathan Jones. Their safeties were Devin McCourty, Patrick Chung, and Deron Harmon. They were a matchup team. They could play man, they could play zone. Oftentimes, they would play a lot of man, where Butler would match up on a guy, Ryan and Rowe would match up on guys. They did this in the Super Bowl in the second half where they really needed it. This pass rush was really underrated. Trey Flowers was a beast on the inside. Long was a nice pickup. Ninko and Sheard also complemented well. And Hightower was at his peak. Van Noy was just finding his way in the NFL, but was also a great addition to this team later in the year. They had a 212-point differential with Tom Brady in 15 games. That would mean they won on an average by 14 games. 14 points, sorry, not 14 games. They won by an average of 14 points per game, okay? That includes their loss to Seattle. So their margin, their scoring margin with Tom Brady was 14 points, which, as we mentioned earlier, the highest we had seen already is about 10.5. So that's like 4 points better than any team on this entire list, okay? And when you look at them deeper, statistically, all right, you've got the 5th best offense in points per drive, 2nd on defense, 6th in yards on offense, 10th on defense, 4th in yards on offense. Remember, these stats are also with Jimmy Garoppolo and with Jacoby Brissett. Not all of these stats on offense are not with Tom Brady for all of the games. So their offense was actually better than these stats, okay? But 5th on points on offense, 6th in yards on offense, 4th in passing yards, 7th in rushing offense. They had no flaw at all. Like, even more so than the Eagles that we looked at. Their defense was 12th in pass defense. That was the lowest they had as a rank across the board. Their SRS was 1st, 9.29. And even with Tom Brady being removed from the lineup for 4 games, they had a 12.3 scoring margin, which is the best on this list. So, and actually, the 2016 Patriots have the best scoring margin since the 2007 Patriots. I went back and looked. So, yeah, this was low-key one of the best, most dominant teams of all time. And I don't think people really realize that. But the 2016 Patriots are number 1. I hope you guys enjoyed this list. If you did, Gronk spike the like button and subscribe. I love doing this for you guys, looking historically at the NFL. Let me know if I was right about my placement on the Eagles and all the other teams on this list. Debate in the comments. It's Mitch. Peace.